6 of the creepiest unsolved mysteries of all time. Who doesn't love to dig into a long unsolved mystery here and there? The creepier the better. I think it's because we've all got a little Nancy Drew, or Hardy Boys stuck inside us from childhood, or maybe we're all just a little bit morbid. Either way, below are 6 of the creepiest unsolved mysteries of all time, guaranteed to get your brain juices flowing, and have you wondering whether you're too old to sleep with the light on at night. 1. The Hinterkaifeck murders. On a small lonesome farm in modern-day Weihenfen, Bavaria, Germany, a family of 6 was discovered murdered. Each member was killed by their attacker with the mattock, a hand tool similar to a pickaxe. The Gruber family, Andreas Gruber, 63, his wife Kazilia Gruber, 72, daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, her children Kazilia, 7, and Joseph, 2, and finally the maid Maria Baumgartner, 44, were found horribly butchered by their neighbors on April 4, 1922. The event itself, while shocking, is only the start of a string of unsettling pieces of information that were only revealed after the murders. Sometime before the massacre, the Grubers had a different maid who wanted nothing more than to leave the farm and work elsewhere. She claimed it was haunted, that she heard footsteps in the attic, and noticed small things out of place. One night, Mr. Gruber watched her walk off the property and leave forever. Months later, the family's new maid wouldn't get out so lucky. It started with a string of inexplicable occurrences, footprints in the snow coming from the woods to the back door, but not leading back, creaking in the attic, and unfamiliar newspaper in the kitchen. Then house keys went missing, and someone tried to break the lock on the tool shed. Andreas Gruber, a farmer living 60 miles north of Munich, Germany, couldn't decide what to make of it. He confided these strange incidents to neighbors and friends, but they were still stunned when, on a chilly night in 1922, Andreas and his family, wife Kazilia, daughter Victoria, grandchildren Kazilia and Joseph, and housemaid Maria Baumgartner were slaughtered with a pickaxe in their home, the Hinterkaifeck ranch. The Hinterkaifeck murders shook the public, both from the brutality and the bizarre circumstances surrounding the homicides. Police deduced that Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and young Kazilia were somehow lured to the livestock barn and slaughtered one by one. Afterward, the killer, or killers, entered the house and bludgeoned little Joseph while he slept in his parents' bedroom. Then they headed to Maria's room and murdered her, too. The bodies were discovered the following Tuesday, after young Kazilia failed to show up for school. While police suspected robbery, they soon abandoned the theory after finding money in the house. Numerous interrogations turned up nothing. Meanwhile, autopsies revealed young Kazilia survived her initial attack. While lying next to her dead family in the barn, she had torn out tufts of hair before finally succumbing to her wounds. Creepier still, the killer stuck around. Food had clearly been eaten from the kitchen. Someone continued to feed the cattle. Neighbors reported smoke rising from the chimney and even the dog had been let out. Whoever slaughtered the residents of Hinterkaifeck stayed through the weekend and took care of the place before moving on. More than 100 suspects were questioned about the killings, the most recent being in 1986. In 2007, students of the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy determined that the Hinterkaifeck murders would likely remain unsolved forever. 2. The Sodder children disappearance of 1945. What truly happened to the 5 Sodder children? A drive to Fayetteville, West Virginia is nothing short of inspiring. Winding roads past stark groves of sycamore and ash that cling to the ridged steps of the Appalachian Mountains. Around one bend, near the community of Hawk's Nest, is a kitschy relic of roadside Americana, the Mystery Hole. Entering Fayetteville itself, you cross the impressive New River Gorge Bridge, a 3,030-foot steel arch that spans the cool waters of the New River. But for decades, travelers coming into Fayetteville were treated to a far more somber sight, a billboard depicting the photos of 5 children and a plaintive plea from their parents seeking news about their fates. The official explanation of the disappearance of the Sodder children, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, aged 5 to 14, is that they died in a fire that consumed the Sodder family house on Christmas Eve 1945. The alternative explanation entertained by the Sodder parents, the Sodder children who survived the blaze, and an active network of amateur sleuths, is that the children were kidnapped from the burning home as retribution against the family. George and Jenny Sodder were both Italian immigrants, although only George, who immigrated when he was 13, spent an appreciable amount of time in his home country. The couple was a shining example of the American dream. George went from working railroads in Pennsylvania to owning a small trucking company in West Virginia. He and his wife had 10 children and lived in a 2-story home just north of Fayetteville, where many Italian immigrants and their descendants had settled. George was many things: a hard worker, a dedicated family man, but he never shied away from sharing his beliefs. He frequently discussed his disapproval of fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who was seen by some pre-World War II Italian Americans as a model of strength who had made Italy great again. Arguments with other Italian Americans were common, and the family claimed that during the war years, George was the subject of threats. On Christmas Eve 1945, the family was celebrating with 9 of their 10 children. War was over, which meant that eldest son Joe would soon return from the army. Daughter Marion had bought presents for the youngest Sodder siblings with income from a new job. At night, 5 of the Sodder children retired to the upstairs attic for bed. In the middle of night, around 1 a.m., Jenny Sodder awoke to a bang on the roof followed by a rolling noise. She drifted back to sleep, but awoke 30 minutes later to the smell of smoke. It wasn't long before she discovered a fire burning from a fuse box in George's office. The Christmas lights still twinkled in the living room downstairs, and the children were still asleep in the attic. George, Jenny, Marion, 2-year-old Sylvia, and 2 of the older Sodder boys escaped the house. One of these boys, John Sodder, initially claimed that he went upstairs to wake his siblings. He later changed his account, saying he had only called up to them. The fire could not have occurred at a more disastrous time. It was Christmas and the middle of the night, the town of Fayetteville was shut down. Many local men were still in the military, and the fire department was barely staffed. In addition, a series of mysterious misfortunes made rescue impossible. A high ladder, usually stored against an external wall, had vanished. The water in the water barrel was frozen and the phone line was down. George Sodder tried to start his trucks, so he could park below the attic window, climb upon the roof and rescue the children. But the engines wouldn't start, despite working fine earlier that week. Desperately, George climbed the walls and broke open an attic window, cutting his arm in the process. Even still, he could not reach the upstairs bedroom. Heartbroken, the Sodder family watched as their house and, they assumed, their 5 children burned through the night. The fire department didn't arrive until 8 o'clock the following morning. One reason for the lateness? Fayetteville's fire chief F.J. Morris, who could not drive his own department's fire truck. A cursory 2-hour examination ensued, even though fire investigations often lasted days, or even weeks. No bones were found, and the Sodders were told their children must have burned away completely. Later, George Sodder, unable to endure the sight of his ruined home, used the bulldozer to bury what remained under 5 feet of dirt. In the coming weeks, the Sodders came to believe their children had, in fact, been kidnapped, perhaps by mafia members, who resented George's anti-Mussolini rants. The missing house ladder was found tossed into a nearby ravine. Investigators concluded the fire was the result of faulty wiring, even though George recently had an electrician rewire the house and the Christmas lights remained on as the fire burned. A nearby hotel owner claimed to have hosted strange lodgers traveling with a set of children. After chatting with a local crematorium employee, Jenny Sodder determined there was no way the children's bones could have been incinerated. The Sodders hired a private investigator, who soon unearthed a shocking lead. Fayetteville's fire chief F.J. Morris had apparently found a heart among the ashes of the house. He secretly packed the heart into a box and then buried it. The tip was initially confessed to a minister, who confirmed the account to George Sodder. When confronted with the accusation, Morris admitted to the story. He took Sodder to the spot where he buried the remains. Indeed, a box was buried in the ground with some flesh inside, but a local funeral director declared it was fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to extreme heat. Many point to this bizarre twist as evidence that Morris was indeed trying to convince the Sodders that their children had died in the fire, throwing them off of the youngsters' true fate. In a sense, the theory may be true. Morris may have been trying to convince the Sodders that their children died that night. But it wasn't because he was covering up a kidnapping. Rather, he was covering up his own incompetence. By the chief's own admission, he could not drive his department's fire truck. The short 2-hour investigation on Christmas morning was hardly adequate. And George Sodder may well have buried the Sodder children's remains too deeply when he bulldozed dirt over the smoldering ruins of the house. The Sodders themselves never abandoned the theory that their children had been kidnapped. Billboards and advertisements asked after their fates. In 1967, a photo was sent to the Sodders, claiming to portray an outgrown little Louis, although this may have been a cruel trick played on a family whose tragic story had by then become national news. Although multiple follow-ups on various tips have yielded little to no substantive developments, the kidnapping theory lingers to this day. 3. The crew of the Cerrillo. More than 35 years later, the Cerrillo mystery leaves us with more questions than answers. This is Maritime's story of 5 strong men who went leisure fishing on a beautiful day in Hawaii but never returned. Subsequently, one of the men reappeared 10 years later on a remote atoll in the Pacific Ocean, only to add another twist to the case. This is the Cerrillo mystery. Maritime history is awash with stories of all sorts of unexplained events taking place. Some of these are precisely that, stories. Mariners that set sail from one port either return to the same one or berth at a different one with wild tales along the theme of the one that got away. The seas and the oceans of the world are notorious for not giving up their secrets without a fight. The HMS Deadless Sea Serpent, Flight 19, Mary Celeste, Amelia Earhart and the Titanic are just a few of the more popular oceanic mysteries, from the past century or two. Unexpected weather. The Cerrillo mystery began on February 11, 1979, when a quintet of friends boarded a Boston whaler named the Cerrillo. This modest vessel was 17 feet in length and had an 85-horsepower engine. It was unequipped for any major sea voyages. When the boat cast off from the town of Hana on the Hawaiian island of Maui, the conditions for sailing could not have been any better. There was barely any wind, and the surface was as smooth as glass. Within just 2 hours of departure, close to noon, the local weather worsened. None of the 5 had checked local sailing conditions or the weather reports, preferring to keep eyes on the horizons instead. This is a typical action on the part of amateur sailors that only expect to be out to sea for a matter of hours. Had any of them done so, they may have become aware of a major low-pressure system approaching the islands. If the storm that hit the town was any indication, then the conditions out at sea must have been horrendous, and wholly unsuitable for even the most expert of sailors. Gale force winds and torrential rain more than likely tossed the boat around like a rag doll. A number of larger fishing vessels managed to make it back to port, and reports suggest that the swells peaked at a height of 40 feet. Even though hope was futile at best, none of the locals and relatives of the missing crew were willing to just sit tight and do nothing. A search of the coastline took place, even though visibility was about as bad as it could get. However, conditions were too rough to search further out until the storm abated. Disappearance at sea. The Cerrillo mystery fueled a huge search. On the following day after the disappearance, the Coast Guard recommenced its mission. Over time it grew into a large flotilla of ships, boats and aircraft. For 5 days, the search covered 70,000 square miles of ocean, but they found no trace of the 5 men or the boat. The real problem that the investigators had was that nobody knew in what direction the group went or where they ended up. The strong currents of the Isle Channel didn't help matters either. They even brought in homing pigeons specially trained to locate people stranded at sea. Almost a week after the storm, experts concluded that the Cerrijo wrecked and sank with all hands on board. Family and friends of the missing man weren't so quick to abandon their hopes. They pooled their cash and resources and managed to maintain a search for an extra 3 weeks. Their main focus was on some of the more remote islands in the hope that somehow the boat had made landfall on one of them. No trace of the men, listed below, or the boat could be found. A memorial service was held for the crew, which would go on to become an annual event. Scott Moorman, 27 Benjamin Kalama, 38 Peter Hanchett, 31 Patrick Wosner, 26 Ralph Malay Akini, 27 a decade later. With the search being called off, that might have been the end of things. The public had forgotten about the Cerrijo mystery. It was just another tragedy in a long list of disappearances at sea. However, a decade later, several of the original search party members were on a routine wildlife mission in the uninhabited islands of the Western Pacific for the National Marine Fisheries Service. The Marshall Islands and the remote Taongi Atoll, aka Bokak Atoll, are approximately 2,200 miles southwest of Hawaii. On September 10, 1988, biologist John Naughton put himself in the middle of this mystery for the second time. While working at Taongi Atoll, he came across an abandoned fiberglass boat on the coastline. He could only determine part of the registration of the boat, but it was enough to ascertain that it came from somewhere in the Hawaiian Islands. Further investigation carried out at the time established that Naughton had solved the mystery of what happened to the Cerrijo, a seaman's burial. But that just raised many more questions. There was nothing inside or around the boat itself. They looked for signs of life, notes, or any kind of equipment that might provide clues. However, there were none. Naughton and his team took a moment to decide what to do next, and they decided they would search the surrounding area. Almost immediately, the team made another discovery about 100 yards from the boat. A makeshift cross fashioned from driftwood was sticking out of the top of a shallow grave. Also, a human mandible bone protruded out of the cairn of coralline shingle stones. As they examined the grave closer, they saw blank pieces of paper resting on top of the skeleton. All of this paper was loose, but was stacked like an unbound manuscript or book. In between each slice of paper was what Naughton would later describe as tinfoil. The bundle of 3-inch square papers was roughly 3/4 of an inch thick. They did not serve any function that the biology team could imagine. The foreman collectively decided that any further excavation of the grave might be disrespectful. Thus, they took no additional attempts to proceed. Who built the cairn? Investigators sent the mandible to a forensics lab for testing. Results revealed that the remains were those of Scott Moorman. Several other smaller bones found beyond the gravesite also matched Moorman. They did not find any other remains on the entire islet. The outboard motor from the Cerrijo remained missing as well. It does seem likely that Moorman and the boat drifted to the area more by luck than judgment. But what about the remaining crew? No trace of them has ever been found. This leads to the obvious question that nobody has yet provided a satisfactory answer to. Who buried Scott Moorman? One of the more plausible theories revolves around an Oriental burial tradition. Chinese traditionally include in a coffin the provision of small pieces of paper, or a paper money separated by gold or silver foil. These items are interred with the corpse as a means of fortune for the afterlife. This matches the type of burial the researchers found at Taongi Atoll. Hence, it is possible that a fishing boat from either could have come across the deceased or ailing Moorman. If they were fishing illegally, they may have provided him with a proper burial according to their local customs without reporting it. Now the question has to be asked about the remaining 4. Plausibly, the storm took all 4 men. Perhaps this left the unfortunate Scott Moorman alone in the middle of the Pacific with little to no supplies or much hope of rescue. More questions on the Cerrijo mystery. There is a lot more to the Cerrijo mystery than the disappearance and reappearance of a single man from 5. The Cerrijo was not the most sturdy of vessels constructed, and was really only designed for coastal use. How the boat survived one of the worst storms on record, and ended up on a desolate atoll thousands of miles away is quite an accomplishment. Experts that better understand events such as this reckon that the drift time between Hawaii and the Marshall Islands would have been somewhere in the region of 3 months. That in itself does raise a question or two. 4 years before Naughton got to the island, another research team landed there and reported nothing out of the ordinary. Witnessing a discarded boat might seem trivial enough to omit it from official reports, but the grave? So where was the boat between leaving Hawaii on February 11, 1979, and 1984 when the original expedition made landfall on the Marshall Islands? The Cerrijo mystery endures. 4. The missing lighthouse keepers. On the 26th of December 1900, a small ship was making its way to the Flannan Islands in the remote Outer Hebrides. Its destination was the lighthouse at Eileen Moor, a remote island which, apart from its lighthouse keepers, was completely uninhabited. Although uninhabited, the island has always sparked people's interest. It is named after Street Flannan, a 6th-century Irish bishop who later became a saint. He built a chapel on the island, and for centuries shepherds used to bring over sheep to the island to graze but would never stay the night, fearful of the spirits believed to haunt that remote spot. Captain James Harvey was in charge of the ship, which was also carrying Joseph Moore, a replacement lighthouse keeper. As the ship reached the landing platform, Captain Harvey was surprised not to see anyone waiting for their arrival. He blew his horn and sent up a warning flare to attract attention. There was no response. Joseph Moore then rowed ashore and ascended up the steep set of stairs that led it up to the lighthouse. According to reports from Moore himself, the replacement lighthouse keeper suffered an overwhelming sense of foreboding on his long walk up to the top of the cliff. Once at the lighthouse, Moore noticed something was immediately wrong. The door to the lighthouse was unlocked, and in the entrance hull 2 of the 3 oilskin coats were missing. Moore continued on to the kitchen area, where he found half-eaten food in an overturned chair, almost as if someone had jumped from their seat in a hurry. To add to this peculiar scene, the kitchen clock had also stopped. Moore continued to search the rest of the lighthouse but found no sign of the lighthouse keepers. He ran back to the ship to inform Captain Harvey, who subsequently ordered a search of the islands for the missing men. No one was found. Harvey quickly sent back a telegram to the mainland, which in turn was forwarded to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. The telegraph read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Duckett, Marshall and the occasional have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket but, as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Night coming on, we could not wait to make something as to their fate. I have left Moore, MacDonald, buoy master and 2 seamen on the island to keep the light burning until you make other arrangements. Will not return to Oban until I hear from you. I have repeated this wire to Muirhead in case you are not at home. I will remain at the telegraph office tonight until it closes, if you wish to wire me." A few days later, Robert Muirhead, the board superintendent who both recruited and knew all 3 men personally, departed for the island to investigate the disappearances. His investigation of the lighthouse found nothing over and above what Moore had already reported. That is, except for the lighthouse's log. Muirhead immediately noticed that the last few days of entries were unusual. On the 12th December, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, wrote of severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. He also noticed that James Duckett, the principal keeper, had been very quiet and that the third assistant, William MacArthur, had been crying. What is strange about the final remark was that William MacArthur was a seasoned mariner, and was known on the Scottish mainland as a tough brawler. Why would he be crying about a storm? Log entries on the 13th December stated that the storm was still raging, and that all three men had been praying. But why would three experienced lighthouse keepers, safely situated on a brand new lighthouse that was 150 feet above sea level, be praying for a storm to stop? They should have been perfectly safe. Even more peculiar is that there were no reported storms in the area on the 12th, 13th and 14th of December. In fact, the weather was calm, and the storms that were too bad at the island didn't hit until December 17th. The final log entry was made on the 15th December. It simply reads storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. What was meant by God is over all? After reading the logs, Muirhead's attention turned to the remaining oilskin coat that had been left in the entrance hall. Why, in the bitter cold winter, had one of the lighthouse keepers ventured out without his coat? Furthermore, why had all three lighthouse staff left their posts at the same time, when rules and regulations strictly prohibited it? Further clues were found down by the landing platform. Here Muirhead noticed ropes strewn all over the rocks, ropes which were usually held in a brown crate 70 feet above the platform on a supply crane. Perhaps the crate had been dislodged and knocked down, and the lighthouse keepers were attempting to retrieve them when an unexpected wave came and washed them out to sea? This was the firster and most likely theory, and as such Muirhead included it in his official report to the Northern Lighthouse Board. But this explanation left some people in the Northern Lighthouse Board unconvinced. For one, why had none of the bodies been washed ashore? Why had one of the men left the lighthouse without taking his coat, especially since this was December in the Outer Hebrides? Why had three experienced lighthouse keepers been taken unaware by a wave? Although these were all good questions, the most pertinent and persistent question was around the weather conditions at the time. The seas should have been calm. They were sure of this as the lighthouse could be seen from the nearby Isle of Lewis, and any bad weather would have obscured it from view. Over the following decades, subsequent lighthouse keepers at Eilean have reported strange voices in the wind, calling out the names of the three dead men. Theories about their disappearance have ranged from foreign invaders capturing the men, all the way through to alien abductions. Whatever the reason for their disappearance, something, or someone, snatched those three men from the rock of Eilean on that winter's day over 100 years ago. 5. The Villisca axe murders. On a quiet summer night in Iowa, 8 people were bludgeoned to death while they slept in their beds. Miss Mary Peckham had a terrible feeling about her next-door neighbors. It was a sunny summer morning in 1912, and yet the Moore family household was eerily still. Every curtain was drawn and all of the doors were locked, strange for a friendly town like Villisca, Iowa. After numerous knocks went unanswered, Miss Peckham finally called a Moore relative for help. Ross Moore arrived soon after, with the spare key in hand. Together, they opened the door to one of the grisliest murder scenes in American history. Every member of the Moore family, Josiah and his wife, Sarah, their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, had been bludgeoned to death with an axe. 2 of Mary's friends, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who happened to have slept over that night, were also found dead. All 8 victims were discovered in their beds. Only Lena showed signs of being awake during the attack. Somehow, the killer had slipped in at night and crept through the halls, systematically slaughtering the Moore family and their guests with axe swings so violent he left gouge marks in the ceiling. The grisly Villisca axe murders of June 10, 1912 shocked the surrounding community, both for its random brutality, and the string of bizarre clues left behind at the scene of the crime. A heavy slab of bacon was discovered in the downstairs guest room, beside a broken keychain and the gory murder weapon. A bowl of bloody water sat beside a plate of uneaten food on a table in the kitchen. Creepier still, after his killing was done, the murderer draped cloths over the crushed faces of his victims. He then maneuvered through the home and ceremoniously covered each mirror and exposed window pane with linens pulled from dresser drawers. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Theories abounded, yet there was never enough evidence to convict anyone of the crime. Some accused Frank F. Jones, an Iowa state senator and business rival of Josiah Moore's, of hiring a contract killer to execute the Moore family. Others pointed to a violent man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation, who had bludgeoned his mother and grandmother with an axe in the months after Villisca and was suspected of additional slayings. Others still pointed to Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who actually confessed to the crime in 1917. Kelly was in Villisca at the time of the killings and even posed as an inspector from Scotland Yard to get a closer glimpse of the murder scene. He was also a rumored sexual deviant who struggled with mental health issues his whole life. Soon after signing his confession, the Reverend recanted. He was tried twice for the killings and eventually cleared of all charges. To this day, the Villisca axe murder case remains open, enticing amateur sleuths around the globe. The grisly tale also attracts tourists with a taste for macabre. The Moore homestead in Villisca is now a museum. For around $500 a night, you can even rent the house for a spooky sleepover. 6. Russia's mysterious Dyatlov incident. February 1959, the Ural Mountains in Russia. 10 young cross-country skiers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, 8 guys and 2 girls led by Igor Dyatlov, set out for 2 weeks of adventure. One became ill and turned back. Little did he know he would be the only one to return alive. Weeks later, searchers found one of the most bizarre scenes in modern lore. The bodies of the 9 victims were scattered over a wide area of the frozen landscape. Some were wearing only their underwear. Some were wearing each other's clothes. 2 had head injuries. 1 had no tongue. 2 had severe internal chest injuries. None had any visible external signs of trauma. Some of their clothes were found to be radioactive. Circumstances suggested that some of the victims may have been blind. Various other witnesses in the region reported bizarre orange spheres in the night sky, and strangest of all, the bodies had orange skin and gray hair. This was the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War, and few details other than what I just gave were reported. Journalists attempting to give more information found their books and articles censored. Independent investigators found official records to be missing or classified. Many fingers have pointed at military testing. Did radioactivity from some secret weapons test drive the group insane? Some people think UFOs are responsible for the deaths, citing the reports from other skiers in the region who saw the orange spheres in the night sky in the direction of the Dyatlov party. Russian authorities closed the case, called the cause of death a compelling unknown force, and classified it top secret. The mountain was renamed Dyatlov Pass. And that's about all that anyone's ever been able to learn about the case. I found some translated articles from Russian media and some Western articles, and although the case offers some really compelling mysteries, it also offers an elephant in the room, the possibility of avalanches being the culprit. I wanted to see how likely avalanches would have been in that area, so I looked it up on Google Earth. Turns out it's hardly the type of place you'd expect avalanches. The hills are low and rounded, much better for cross-country skiing than for avalanches, at least according to my personal and formal assessment from looking at the terrain on Google Earth. And, obviously, the group felt comfortable enough with any potential danger to make camp where they did. But I also found a Russian tourism brochure for the area that warns of avalanche danger on slopes steeper than 15 degrees. According to the police reports, the slope immediately above the campsite was at 22-23 degrees, and 50 to 100 meters above the campsite it increased to 25-30 degrees. That's quite steep. There was a cornice, and the snow at the campsite was 2 meters deep. There has also been much discussion in the Russian press about the possible role of avalanches in the Dyatlov Pass incident. So I'm going to go ahead and call avalanches a plausible factor in the tragedy. A number of skeptics have addressed the question of radioactivity by pointing out that the mantles used in camping lanterns contain thorium, which emits alpha particle radiation, to the point that there is actually a radiation warning on the packaging. These mantles, if you're not familiar with them, are little fabric bags that serve as the wick in a burning lantern. They're quite fragile and easily turn to dust that gets everywhere, like onto the clothes of everyone in the tent, when you replace them, which you need to do pretty regularly. Thorium gas mantles were invented in 1891 and were manufactured in many countries for a long time. Coleman, the largest U.S. manufacturer, only phased them out in the 1990s. I found a blog comment signed Igor, a guy who says he's Russian and went to the same college as the Dyatlov Pass victims, and he states in his comment that thorium gas mantles were not available in Russia in 1959. That doesn't sound consistent with general articles on the subject. Plus, I found a Russian wheel lantern on eBay that was kerosene-fueled, and all the kerosene lanterns I could find details on used thorium gas mantles. It's a question mark, and remains a plausible possibility in my book. Here is my proposed explanation of what happened. It's wrong, of course, because it's done from my armchair 50 years after the fact and with no first-hand knowledge of the region, but it's completely reasonable and does adequately satisfy the facts as we know them. 9 skiers set up camp in an area with potential avalanche danger, but no more or less danger than would have been found if they set up anywhere else they could have reached before nightfall. Sometime during the night, a loud noise, either from a nearby avalanche, a jet aircraft, or military ordnance, convinced at least 5 members of the group that an avalanche was bearing down on them. They burst out of the tent wearing whatever they happened to be sleeping in and ran. At some point one of them fell and struck his head on a rock. They became lost in the dark and poor visibility, or simply found themselves stranded with their injured friend, and finally built a fire. They quickly got hypothermia and probably shouted themselves hoarse for their friends. 2 of them lost consciousness and the others made a desperation decision to take what little clothes their 2 unconscious bodies had and risk it all to try and make it back to camp. One made it 300 meters, the second made it 480, and the third a full 630 meters before all 5 were dead from hypothermia. Back at camp, the 4 who didn't panic and run away in the night got dressed, collected provisions, and began to search for their friends. They searched for hours, circling high and low, until at some point either through a slip or just bad luck, they were caught in a real avalanche. During the resulting turmoil, one received a fatal skull fracture, one received 12 broken ribs, and one bit her tongue off, all perfectly plausible injuries during such a traumatic death. Their bodies remained buried until the spring thaw, as is so common with avalanche victims. At the open casket funeral for the first 5 victims, relatives saw the combination of 5 days of winter sunburn in those days before sunscreen, and the mortician's effort to cover up frostbite and a full month of exposure to the elements, and described it as a strange orange color, though others described it simply as a deep tan, which is consistent with reasonable expectations. And who knows what hair would have looked like after all that exposure, and who knows what kind of treatment done by the mortician. So I can't assign too much significance to what amounts to a few anecdotal reports from some funeral attendees, and not even all funeral attendees. Plus I'm quite certain that if UFOs had turned all of their hair really gray, don't you think the Cold War Russian authorities would have had it colored back to normal for an open casket funeral? Their bodies had been exposed outdoors for weeks. Of course they looked terrible. What of the radiation on their clothes? Well, there is at least as much uncertainty about what the Russians were doing with their atomic and thermonuclear weapons in that area in those days, as there is about exactly what type of radiation and how much was found on the Dyatlov Pass victims. Since we don't know anything about either, we can't say that any explanation is inconsistent with what was found. And the thorium lantern mantle question quite probably makes the entire radiation issue a moot point. Assuming they'd changed the lantern mantle sometime during the trip, which nearly always has to be done, there's every reason to expect to find low-level alpha radiation on the clothes of anyone who participated. How about those UFO reports? Well, people all around the world report UFOs every day, and whether anything happened to the Dyatlov party or not, it's not especially surprising that skiers in the Ural Mountains saw UFOs that night. What did that have to do with the Dyatlov party? We have a statistically insignificant correlation, with a sample size of 1, and no reason to suspect that one thing had anything to do with the other. Human psychology encourages us to think anecdotally and assume a causal relationship, but for my money, I consider the UFO question irrelevant. Maybe if the UFOs were identified, and known to have some specific physical capability, then we'd have something to talk about. The Russian newspaper reports stating that the victims may have been blinded appears to be pure speculation, based only on 2 observations: first, that some of them were wearing the wrong clothes, and second, that when they built their campfire they didn't use some dry wood nearby. Is it really necessary to conclude that blindness, ostensibly caused by UFOs, is the most likely explanation for the choice of firewood? 5 panicked young people, underdressed, in sub-zero temperatures and near-zero visibility darkness, were lucky to get a fire built at all. I think we can cut them a little slack on what firewood they were able to find.